In this tutorial, we're going to be creating the Sunflower Beach Tote. This one is going over assembling all of these squares for the tote bag and how to sew them together. The videos for how to create these squares will be linked in the description box below, and also the link for the final video of this series of how to create the top border and the handles will also be linked in the description box below. Alright, so to do this pattern, what we're going to need is, step one, we're going to need 21 of our sunflower granny squares. Now it is possible you could do anything different. I do have another video of how to make the daisies for this tote bag. I'll go ahead and link that one into the bottom, but to make these squares, it's actually, I have a series of tutorials of how to exactly step by step make each one of these squares. So that will also be the top links into the video description for how to make these. But you'll need 21 of those. We're going to need a darning needle in order to sew in all of our ends. You could also do it using a slip stitch going along the edge into each stitch. But for this tutorial purposes, we're going to use the darning needle. And we will need a pair of scissors in order to cut all of our yarn. And so for this is the actual diagram of how we need to sew each one of the squares together. And this is a line if it's all laid out flat before we sew up the sides. We're going to come down this side and then down, across, down, across here, here, turn, and then coming straight across here, and then straight across here. And that is with the fewest cut-offs and everything that I could find to sew your entire bag together. Now you can pick a different way of sewing them all together, however you choose, but this is how they'll all be laid out. So to begin, we're going to get a length of yarn and thread it into our darning needle. And make sure to use the same type of yarn, whatever you use for the squares. I'm using acrylic for this one, but you can use cotton, wool, bamboo, whatever you choose. And so we're going to start here, and what I want to do is sew these two squares together. So I'm going to grab two squares. All right. And then if you look into the corners, there is two chain ones for each corner. So one chain one would be on this side and the other chain one goes along the other side. So I'm going to insert into the chain one for this side on either one of these in order to sew them together. And then I'll go ahead and tie on my yarn right into that stitch. I am going to leave the tails slightly long so that I can more easily weave in all the ends at the very end. And now to go down this side, we're just going to go, because each stitch, unless you missed a stitch into one of your squares, should line right up. So I'm just going through both loops of each square, coming right down the center and attaching them together. All right, now that we're here at the end of sewing our first two squares together, now because these two are what's going to go on next, so we're just going to grab two more squares and just continue, just continue right down, just starting into the next squares. So here I have my next two squares. And then I'm just going to start also right into that chain one for the sides. And keep sewing down. and like I'm kind of pulling them apart. You want to keep them kind of close together. Make sure you don't get a big gap in between. So yeah, I am pulling the yarn as I'm sewing right down. All right, now that we've gone down this side, now we're going to make a turn and sew down this side. So right here, we're going to be turning and we're going to start working down this side. So we'll grab another square and sew on right to this existing square. Once again, right into the corners. Now for this one, I'm going to start my stitch right into that second chain one for the corner. And match up. And then just continue sewing all the way down the side to attach this next piece onto our bag. All right, now we've gotten all this so far. So we've came down here and we've made our little turn. Made our turn to come down. If that shows it a little better. So we're going to want to take 2 more squares and attach them right here, which will be these 2 squares. All right, now we've gotten that square on. And once again, here's our little legend of how to do it. So we've gotten these 2 sewn on, so we want to attach 2 more squares right here at the bottom, like this. So we're going to continue sewing right along down this seam. All right, now that we've gotten that all sewn on, we'll come right back to our little legend for it. So we've gotten the 3 coming down this side sewn together. Now what we want to do is we're going to turn, coming down, and what we're going to want to do is turn and come across. So here we just want to sew 1 square on right here. Because we came down this seam, so right to here we want to sew these 2 squares together, so going down that seam. All right, so now I've just sewn on this piece, which is right here. So now what we want to do is grab 2 more pieces to sew on. right here, and we're just going to come right down this center seam of these two. Okay. Now we've just finished sewing on these two. Right here were these two. So now we're going to turn and come down. So on the end here, we're going to add one square right to here. All right, so that goes right here, and we're just going to come down. So we're going to come off this corner and sew down this seam. All right, so we've just sewn on this square right here. So now what we want to do is add 2 squares right down here, and we're just going to sew down this seam to sew these 2 on. All right, so now we've just finished sewing these 2 pieces on. Now what we're going to want to do is come around, and we want to attach this piece to the bottom. So we grab another square, and we're just going to sew right along this seam until, so we can get this piece sewn on. All right, now we've just sewn on this bottom piece, so we want to come back up to this square, so along this side, and we want to sew one more square right onto here. So we're just going to sew this piece right on. All right, now we've just sewn on this piece. So what we're going to want to do is turn and sew together right along this seam. Sew together these 2 sides of these squares, so we're not having to add any more. So we just come up, turn, and sew together right along this seam until here. Now we've just sewn down this seam, so attaching these 2 squares. Now what we want to do is turn and go up. So to show you right from where we are, we want to come here and go straight up and sew together these 4 squares, just sewing right along the seam until we reach the top up here. All right, so we've just sewn up this seam right here. So now what we're going to want to do is turn and come across right here through these two, right through these two here, and I will meet you once we reach right here, right at the end of these two. So we finished here and we just want to go right across those two squares. All right, so we've just finished sewing along these two squares right here. Now what we're going to do is take two more squares, which will be these two squares, and we're just going to sew the seam right between them. All right, so we've just attached these two squares. Now what we're going to want to do is turn from here, and we're going to want to sew on one square right to the edge where we sewed the two on. So we sewed on these two. Now we want to sew on this square right here. So we're going to come right up the side. All right, so we've just sewn on this square here. So we want to sew on our last square right next to it. So we're just going to sew right along this seam. So that'll take us right to here, and we can end and tie off right there. All right, and then once you reach the end, go ahead and tie it off. Now you can go ahead and weave in all your ends right now if you'd like to stay super tidy on everything as you're sewing. For me, it doesn't really bother me that much. So now we have all those sewn together, but we have two more seams that we need to do, which is right down the center here and right down the center here. So right here at this little peak, I'm just going to attach a piece of yarn and sew down these four pieces and just attach right into that upper corner. All right, now that we're at the end of this section, we can go ahead and tie off. All right, so now we only have one more seam left before we have it, well, the flat laid out section. So we did this seam, now we just need to do this seam. So we come to the other section where it's still pulled apart, and we just want to take a piece of yarn and sew down between these 4 squares, well, technically 8 squares. And then we will go ahead and start folding it together to piece it all together as soon as that is done. And we're just continuing sewing. Everything, once again, is all matched stitch to stitch. All right, now that we're at the end, go ahead and tie off. And I'm going to go ahead and weave in this end also. All right, so we have all the seams sewn together so far. All right, now that we've got all the squares sewn onto basically the base of the bag, what we're going to want to do is lay your project out, and then we want to fold along this seam where you can look at your squares, fold it right along that seam. There's only one square, and if you look, your top 2 little corners here, these are going to match up with the very tips here. So go ahead and fold that together. And then we're going to take a piece of our yarn into our darning needle. And we're going to go ahead and attach it right to the very bottom of the one side of the bag. So right into that first chain 1 of the side. So we'll be sewing up this seam. And we're just going to sew together these 2 right along this side. All right, now that we've reached this corner, so what we're going to want to do is take this square and fold it over like this, and we want to sew down this seam and up here, but only going through the one side. So right along here, be sure not to sew it to the back side of there. All right, and now for the next little square section, we're gonna do the same thing that we did for right here. We're just gonna take this square, fold it over, and sew up along this side right to here. All right, and then once we're at the end here, we can go ahead and tie off. And then all we want to do is repeat that exact same procedure, but for the other side. We'll flip it over and attach yarn here and sew up, fold this side in, sew up, and then end right here into the corner. All right, and go ahead and weave in all of your ends, and I will meet you back here in the next video and show you how to do the top and the handles for the bag.